His lips brushed against mine gently, yet with an undeniable intensity, making my heart race. The kiss, hesitant at first, surged through me like an electric current, filling me with a warmth that I couldn't ignore. My hands moved instinctively, one resting on his arm, the other cradling his face. My fingers traced the rough stubble on his jaw, sending a shiver through me. In that brief moment, the world around us seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but the heat of his lips on mine, the steady rhythm of our hearts beating in sync. It all began on a quiet Sunday afternoon, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. The house, usually alive with sound, now seemed cloaked in an eerie calm. I had spent the morning cleaning, busying myself with small tasks to quiet my restless mind, but unease lingered like a shadow. My husband had gone on a spontaneous fishing trip with friends, leaving an unusual void behind. Upstairs, my stepson, Kalian, was in his room. Music seeped through the walls, soft, melancholic notes that seemed to merge with the silence of the house. Kalian, at 22, exuded confidence, yet beneath that exterior was an enigma I had never entirely unraveled. Our bond was quiet but steady, like an unspoken pact that had grown stronger over the years. After finishing the dishes, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and stood by the kitchen window, letting the warm sunlight wash over me. But instead of feeling relaxed, a strange tension coiled around me, an unexplainable sense that something was off. The air itself felt charged, pushing me toward action. Setting the glass down, I climbed the stairs. The faint strains of music continued, steady and distant. Kalian's door was ajar, just enough for light and sound to escape. I hesitated, debating whether to knock or leave him be. Yet, as though drawn by an invisible force, I moved closer. Are you curious to find out what Kalian is doing and what will happen next in this mysterious story? Before we dive back in, we'd love it if you could take 5 seconds to hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to bring you even more thrilling stories. Kalian sat on the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed but his focus radiating an intense energy. His hands moved with precision, each motion deliberate, as if performing a secretive ritual I couldn't quite grasp. His eyes lowered, his brows furrowed in deep concentration, as if he were completely absorbed in something profoundly significant. My heart raced as I realized what he was doing. The sheer intimacy of the moment should have made me turn away, giving him the privacy I believed he still had. But I couldn't move. My gaze was locked, drawn into the strange, almost magnetic pull of the scene unfolding before me. It was too compelling, too impossible to look away from. I stood frozen in place, caught between a strange mix of surprise and curiosity. There was something about the fragility of the moment, how Kalian seemed completely unaware of the world outside his room, that mesmerized me. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sunlight, its warm rays casting delicate shadows that accentuated the wrinkles on his face and the curve of his shoulders. I knew I shouldn't be standing there, watching him, but the sight of him so unguarded, so genuinely unaware, stirred something deep within me. A curiosity, an unspoken question that I couldn't ignore. Just as I was about to pull myself back together, Kalian looked up. Before I could regain my composure, his eyes locked with mine through the narrow gap in the door. Time seemed to freeze. His expression shifted from surprise to something entirely different, a mixture of confusion and uncertainty. His hands remained still, and for a brief moment, neither of us moved. We were both trapped in a shared silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to find something to break the tension, but every word got stuck in my throat, my heart pounding violently in my chest, creating a chaotic rhythm that echoed in my ears. Kalian was the first to move, hurriedly wrapping a blanket around himself, his face flushed bright red. I couldn't believe he was going upstairs, he mumbled, his voice small and hesitant. "I'm sorry," I said, my face burning as I backed away from the door. "I didn't mean to, I didn't know those words." The words rushed out of my mouth quickly, almost without thought. But Kalian shook his head and raised his hand to stop me. "It's fine," he said quickly, though his voice trembled, as if trying to suppress his emotions. "Just give me a minute." I nodded, stepping back down the hallway to the top of the stairs, where the air felt heavier than ever. My thoughts were jumbled, not knowing whether I should leave or stay, but the image of Kalian, vulnerable and unprotected, was etched into my mind, like a scar that could never be erased. My hand gripped the railing tightly as I struggled to steady my breath, a whirlwind of thoughts running through my mind, each one more perplexing than the last. I had never seen Kalian like this, not just physically, but emotionally. Something in his expression had hit me unexpectedly, something I couldn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. It was something deeper, something I hadn't seen before, and at that moment, I had no idea, but it was the start of something I couldn't yet name. The sound of Kalian's door creaking open cut through my thoughts. He stepped into the hallway, his steps uncertain, avoiding my gaze. He was dressed as usual, in a t-shirt and shorts, but the flush on his cheeks and the awkward way he stood told me something was off. "Sorry about earlier," he muttered, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't mean for you to see that." "I should have knocked," I said, my voice softer than usual, my words rushing out quickly. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine for a split second before darting away. "Guess we're both a little uncomfortable now," he said, a nervous laugh escaping him. Even I felt a bit off balance, tilting my head, unsure of how to process the moment. He shrugged, a small, uneasy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Remember last summer, when I accidentally left the bathroom door unlocked?" The memory hit him like a jolt, and once again, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had completely forgotten about that awkward moment, the brief tension between us that we tried to laugh off. "You're right," he admitted, still sounding a little uneasy. The air between us lightened, the shared memory bridging the gap and softening the tension. The familiar comfort of our past, of our jokes and teasing, started to return. But even as we shared that laughter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something unsaid, hanging just beneath the surface, waiting for us to face it. As the laughter died down, an unsettling silence stretched between us, feeling different in a way I couldn't quite place. To avoid the awkward atmosphere lingering between us for too long, I quickly came up with an excuse that I needed to go to the market, and turned away, leaving Kalian's strange gaze behind. The feeling was hard to describe. It was as though I had walked away from something important, but couldn't turn back. As I left the room, I tried not to look back, but in my chest, there was an unsettling emptiness, something I couldn't quite explain. Kalian didn't say anything more, just silently stood there, watching me. His gaze seemed to be asking something, as if he didn't understand what was going on. That evening, our dinner was quieter than usual, and the silence felt almost suffocating. We both ate without speaking, neither of us looking up from our plates, as if we were each trapped in our own world, unable to bridge the gap. Kalian sat across from me, his eyes fixed on his food, though I could tell he wasn't paying attention to it. I, on the other hand, was battling an internal conflict. Thoughts and emotions tangled together, preventing me from focusing on anything. Part of me said not to do anything, just let it all settle and let things return to normal. It was just an awkward moment, nothing more, and things would move on. But another part of me couldn't let go. I felt like I couldn't just leave Kalian like this. He seemed to be going through something I couldn't understand. Was I doing the right thing? If I didn't speak up, would it make everything worse? I wondered if I had the courage to approach this conversation, a conversation not just about words but about the deeper emotions we both seemed to be holding back. Every time I glanced at Kalian, I could feel the tension in the air, as if we were standing on the edge of something big that neither of us was ready to face. His eyes briefly met mine, and I could see the exhaustion and confusion clearly in them. Was he waiting for me to say something? Could I be the one to help him release whatever weight he was carrying? These questions kept spinning in my mind, making me feel trapped in a whirlwind with no way out. We didn't speak for the rest of the meal, but in my heart, I knew that a conversation needed to happen. But what would happen if I spoke too soon? If I said something that would hurt Kalian without even realizing it? The tension between us was like a taut string, and I wasn't sure whether a small nudge would make everything unravel or if it would lead to some sort of release. Everything felt uncertain, and I found myself standing before a decision not just about our relationship but about myself, not knowing what path to take. After dinner, Kalian quickly stood up and retreated to his room, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I tried to focus on cleaning, but my mind refused to quiet down. Every thought circled around him, and it was becoming impossible to concentrate. The tension in the air was thick, and I knew that if I didn't confront it, it would slowly eat away at me. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to face Kalian. With a cup of tea in hand, I felt its warmth somehow lending me the courage I needed. My heart was heavy, but I knew I couldn't hesitate anymore. As I stood in front of Kalian's door, I knocked lightly, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and there stood Kalian. His face looked distant, as though he was preparing to lie down to sleep, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable, that made me feel like the world was closing in around me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands trembled. "I brought some tea from a friend. Want to try it?" Kalian glanced at me for a moment before nodding slightly, inviting me into the room. As I stepped in, the air in the room felt strangely still. There was a heavy silence that seemed to swallow all the outside noise. Kalian sat down on the bed, his eyes focused on the cup of tea as if lost in thought. He took a small sip, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. After a few moments, he spoke, his voice steady but laced with something heavy. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not living up to the expectations of others," Kalian began, his voice soft but full of introspection. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be the person everyone else wants me to be, that I forgot what I actually want." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. Each sentence seemed to echo in my head, and all I could do was carefully set the cup down, afraid that my trembling hands would betray me. "Kalian," I said gently, though my voice felt like it was about to crack. "That's normal. You're still figuring yourself out, and that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Kalian was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant as if searching for something. Finally, he looked up at me, his gaze filled with doubt. "But what if I can't figure it out? What if I don't like what I find? What if I'm afraid to face it?" His voice was raw, vulnerable, and I could feel the weight of his internal struggle. His words twisted something deep inside of me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "Fear is natural, Kalian. But you're stronger than you think. You don't have to face everything at once," I said, trying to sound confident, though my own heart was tight with emotion. Kalian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just looked at me, his eyes searching, as if looking for something in mine. The moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken understanding, and I couldn't help but feel a deep connection to him, one that couldn't be put into words. I felt like I had spent my entire life trying to become the person everyone else expected me to be, and now, I had no idea how to stop. His words hit me like a crashing wave, and before I could even think, I found myself crossing the room, almost on instinct, to sit beside him on the bed. "Kalian," I whispered, my voice trembling as I reached for his arm, my hand resting gently on his skin. "You don't have to understand everything right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. It's okay to take it step by step." His eyes met mine, full of doubt and something even deeper, something I couldn't quite place. I could feel his pain, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. "But what if I don't even know who I am without all of these expectations?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if the question was too much for him to bear. The words twisted inside me, a mix of anger and sorrow rising. I squeezed his arm, trying to steady myself, to offer him some comfort, but my heart was racing. You're still you, Kalian. The expectations, they don't define you. You're more than that, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. My voice was shaky, but I tried to sound sure. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes lingered on mine, filled with a vulnerability so raw that it made my chest tighten. The room felt suffocating, and the silence between us grew heavy, suffocating in its intensity. How can you say that? His voice cracked, just barely, as his gaze dropped to the floor. What if I'm nothing without all of this? What if I'm lost? I swallowed hard, my own fears creeping in, but I pushed them aside. He needed me now. I leaned in, closer, my breath catching in my throat. You're not lost. You're more than the person they want you to be, Kalian. You're stronger than you think, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. He looked up at me then, his expression torn, as if my words were both a lifeline and a weight. But, what if it's too late for me? What if I can never get back to who I was? I felt my heart skip a beat. This was the moment. It's never too late, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable, but there was something else too, something unspoken, something between us that neither of us dared to fully acknowledge. As the silence stretched on, it wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, the air pulsing with the unvoiced emotions that hung in the room like a storm, waiting to break. In that stillness, I realized that whatever we faced, we would face it together. I don't know what I would do without you, he whispered, his voice low, almost fragile, as his gaze moved to our intertwined hands. My heart skipped a beat, and I responded just as softly, you'll never have to find out. Kyle's eyes lifted to meet mine, searching, uncertain, as though he was trying to decipher something I couldn't see. The air between us thickened, pulsing with a dangerous mix of anticipation and fear. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in from every side. Everything between us had shifted, and in that instant, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. His eyes bore into me, dark and intense, making me feel exposed in a way I couldn't explain. My pulse raced, my skin burning under his gaze. Every breath I took felt too loud, too sharp, echoing in my chest like a drumbeat. I should pull away, I should break the silence, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the magnetic pull of his expression, his vulnerability, his need. Kyle shifted closer, his hand brushing mine again, the touch sparking a jolt of electricity that coursed through my body, setting my nerves on fire. My throat went dry, and my chest tightened as heat pooled between us. The connection between us was undeniable, intoxicating. I wanted him, needed him, to understand how much he meant to me, but all I could do was stare back, helpless against the storm of emotions that raged inside me. I've always been here for you, Kalian, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. Even when I didn't know how to ask for help. His confession hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me, leaving me breathless. My pulse quickened, and I found myself leaning in, unable to resist the pull of his presence. Kyle, I whispered, my voice trembling, barely able to contain the emotions surging within me. You don't have to say it. You've always meant everything to me. His lips curved into a bittersweet smile, one full of pain and longing. I don't even know what happiness looks like for me, he said quietly, his eyes drifting down to where our hands still rested, barely touching. But in that brief contact, I felt a connection that I couldn't deny, something deep and raw. And then, it was like the world stopped. His words, his touch, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me, everything blurred, leaving only the overwhelming heat of the moment. I reached out, unable to stop myself, and took his hand in mine. As I did, his gaze met mine again, wide with something unspoken, something intense, something undeniable. And in that moment, I knew I was lost to him. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, anxiety surging through me. "I don't want to mess this up," he said, his voice a soft whisper, yet heavy with an undeniable weight. I could feel the hesitation in his words, like he was afraid of stepping in the wrong direction. "You won't mess anything up," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, my emotions were a chaotic storm. Our eyes met in a lingering gaze, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The air around us thickened with the tension between us. Neither of us moved, and the silence hung in the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet profound. When he slowly leaned toward me, I couldn't help but feel the uncertainty in his gaze, as if he were looking for something from me, a sign of acceptance or rejection. His lips brushed against mine, cautious and tentative, but neither of us could pull away. The warmth from his kiss spread through me, and I found myself unable to resist the connection that enveloped us. His lips seemed to search for something deeper within me, and I felt the same, like there was something unspoken, something more powerful than words. I couldn't control myself. My hand instinctively moved to his arm, then to his face. My fingers traced his skin, feeling the electricity of the touch run through me. We didn't speak, but the silence between us was more eloquent than any words. In that moment, the world seemed to vanish. There was no sound, no time, only the heat of his lips on mine and the steady beat of my heart, synchronized with his. When we finally pulled apart, my heart raced erratically, a mixture of confusion and fear that I couldn't shake. Yet, in that instant, there was also an undeniable feeling of rightness, one that I couldn't put into words. I knew, deeply, that I cared about him. But I also knew that this couldn't be taken lightly. "We need to be careful," I whispered, my voice trembling with uncertainty. "We need to think this through." He met my gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I don't want to lose this," he said softly, his tone so sincere that it made my chest tighten. I could feel every word he spoke, not just as words but as emotions that ran deep. "We'll take it slow, we'll make sure," I said, my hand resting gently on his thigh, offering him a reassuring smile. "Together." His gaze never left mine, and in that moment, I knew that no matter how difficult it would be, we would face it together.